And we're really, really very pleased to have Christopher Whitcomb here tonight with us. As you all probably know, he's a veteran with the FBI, spent 15 years on the force, and has written his book, Cold Zero, which, as we were discussing, is more than about bombs or terrorists or hostages. It's basically one man's journey and his coming to terms and living in these situations and how these situations affect him as well as the rest of our country. So I'm very pleased to bring him here, and I'm very pleased to introduce him. And would you all please welcome Mr. Christopher Whitcomb.
Well, thank you, Timmy. I appreciate that introduction. It's very kind of you. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate that very much, too. I know it's been pretty tough recently getting anyone out in the streets at all. I just came back from New York this afternoon, and it's very different there than here even, and I know it's very different here than elsewhere in America because these two cities have suffered so much. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. I should warn you that I do terribly with podiums and lecterns. I'm allergic to them. So if I try to come around this thing and talk, you'll have to send me back. Oh, can you? Well, actually, sure. I like going around the other side. But
all right, you can come. Well, hey, whatever you want to do.
I think they need the microphone, don't they?
Why don't you try it? See if they can hear you without.
I'm getting a wand from the back that they need the microphone, so I'll start here and try this. What I'd like to do tonight, really, is talk about what you want to talk about, because I think this book sort of blends with many of the terrible things that have happened in the last week, and sort of talk about what's happening in the world, what's happening with the FBI, if I can shed some light on that. Talk about some of the things I wrote about in the book and give you maybe a little bit of a background, a little bit of an idea what the FBI does, what the United States government does in times of crisis like this, and sort of steer this the way that interests you. So would it be all right if I just started out with a little bit about the book, why I wrote it, something like that, and then just go where you want to go? Well, Cold Zero really started as an accident. This book came about during a conversation I had with a couple guys in New York about 2 years ago. I had 3 chapters of recollections stuck in a drawer someplace in my house. I had written a novel in 1992 that I never did anything with, and had thought about writing another novel, but had just put some of these recollections down and really forgotten about them. But I was talking to these other gents about another project entirely. It was a movie script, ironically, that had nothing to do with these. And that conversation turned to these chapters. These chapters turned to an agent, and the agent turned to this event, which is the first book signing I've gone to, and which is an extraordinary event for me because this is something I've looked forward to all my life. So I look back on the process and really have trouble making sense of it all. For any of you that are aspiring writers, for those of you that have already published, that are way ahead of me, maybe some of you, you might have looked at the process and wondered how you get a book started, how you get a book out, how a book gets onto the bookshelves. And when I look back on the process, I really can't figure out what that process was. My wife's in the back of the room, and she could attest to this story. In originally trying to find an agent for my first novel, I went to everyone I could imagine, and they all gave me the same thing. You know, it was a form letter that said, "Thank you very much for calling us, but you know, we have other people to look at." So I eventually hooked up with an agent in Toronto, Canada, which when you're trying to publish a book in the United States is probably not the best idea. But that's all I had to go to. So I called her up. She read the book. She called me back, which was good because I usually ask for a self-addressed stamped envelope. So she actually called me on the phone, which I thought, hey, I'm making progress now. They're calling me on the phone. And she said, Mr. Whitcomb, she's very formal, Mr. Whitcomb, I really appreciate you calling and sending this book, but I think you should know that I have a Freudian problem with chicken farms, therefore I could not complete your book. So I thought about it and I said, a Freudian problem with chicken farms, which perhaps some psychologists among you could help me out with that a little bit. But I did mention a chicken farm at one point in the book, and apparently that was her way of getting out of considering the thing any further. So that didn't go very well, and that sort of soured me on the whole process. But then a couple of years later, it worked out. So I went back, I got the contract, I went back and I wrote down recollections I had from the times in the FBI that I worked through some of these significant events, and they rolled into a manuscript. The manuscript went up to my editor called back and he said, look, we have to address a couple issues here. One is that this story doesn't make any sense. You have a bunch of recollections, but there's no story here. So that was my big thing, was to go back and turn what had been some very personal experiences for me into a story that might make sense to you. And that took, I don't know, that took a couple months later. And then finally I had to come up with some kind of a title. And I was thinking about different titles for this book, and really I had found myself at a loss. You know, titling a book, especially now, is very difficult because so many titles have been used. You know, I won't even go into some that I considered, but Truman Capote's gotten a lot of them, and Hemingway got a lot of them, and you know, they'd pretty much milked the Bible for all the great lines in there, and there are a considerable number, but they seem to have been taken. So I sat down and I looked at what the book represented to me, what I really wanted to try and do in the book, and what I really wanted this book to be, though some will argue, and I embrace argument and discussion, but what I really wanted to do with the book was try and portray things that I had seen and that I had participated in a way I hadn't seen done before, which was the way what I considered a truthful representation. And those boiled down into two major events, which were Ruby Ridge and Waco, which are two of the most controversial and hotly contested events in law enforcement history, and probably fairly significant events in American history. No one from the FBI had talked much about those events because the FBI, seemed loath to bring up these sorts of subjects and to deal with them. The line at the FBI when all the years that I worked there was, don't worry about what the media write. The American people know what happened, and everything will be okay. Well, look, if the American people know what happened based on what they read and what they see on television, what they hear on the radio and things like that, how can you expect them to know anything else, or how can you expect them to feel anything else? So years went by, things that had been written became fact, and representations made became reality, and I got to a point in writing this book where I thought, I hope I get a chance to change some of those things. So if you bring any presuppositions here tonight, maybe we could discuss them, and maybe I could talk you into at least considering some other alternatives, some other possibilities anyway. So I sat down and said, well, how do I turn that into the title of a book? And what I came up with was a sniper's term. And a sniper's term for hitting your mark came from two words: the cold bore shot, which is pulling a rifle up out of its case and lying down behind it and taking a shot with no warm-up and no practice. That's referred to as the cold bore shot. The zero, or finding your zero for marksmen among you, is when you align the crosshairs of your scope with the impact of your bullet. You take a rifle, you put a scope on it, and they don't have, you have no indication of where they're going to hit, because they're two totally different things. But bringing them into alignment through practice and setting them in so that your rifle and your crosshairs align, your shot hits where you want to, that's called the zero. So you take the cold bore, which is your first shot, you take the zero, which is a zero margin for error, you put the two of them together, and you come up with a metaphor for getting it right the first time, and trying to go out and do something and trying to get it right for the first time. Did we always do that in the FBI? The answer is quite obvious, no. Do we always try? The answer, in my perspective anyway, is yes. So Cold Zero is as much about my attempts to do things right during my career, during the times I've seen and the things I've been thrown into, as anything else. It's billed as Tamir said, as the, inside the hostage rescue team, which most people interpret to be guns and bombs and things like that. And certainly there's some of that, but I think the more you read the book, the more I hope you realize this is about a journey. In this case, it happens to be mine, I suppose. A journey through some of these things, and that you would get the idea that you may have some of the same experiences, that you may experience some of the same emotions that I did, because quite frankly, I'm just like you. That may seem odd because, I carry a badge that says FBI, and because I carry a gun, or have carried a gun for 15 years. But bottom line is, I'm no different than you, and I have the same emotions, and I have the same respects and the same fears and all of those things. And when you put people like me and like you into extraordinary situations, you come up with some unusual, or you find some unusual things about yourself. So that's a long explanation, I think, for a short story, which is how I came up with the story, how the book came about, what I hope to do in the book, and what I hope you'll find interesting, if anything, in the book. The rest of it is about, I think, what we are going through right now as a nation. We're going through an extraordinarily difficult time in dealing with terrorism. We're going through an extraordinarily difficult time in dealing with the human emotions that come with loss and tragedy and suffering and trauma, all of those things. So perhaps I could talk about some of those aspects which I've reflected in the book, and talk about some of those things going on right now, and maybe even answer some of your questions and allay some of your fears. And if I could do that, I'd be happy to. So, this is a point when authors and teachers get a big chill down their spine and they say, are there any questions? Because if there's no hands at all, then you're really in a lot of trouble for the remainder. Okay, sir, thank you.
How would you view Janet Reno's performance as Attorney General with regard to Ruby Ridge and with regard to Waco? Of course, she managed the latter, so to speak.
Right. How would I look at Janet Reno's performance during Ruby Ridge and Waco, and what do I think of Janet Reno? I think Janet Reno had enormous strengths as Attorney General of the United States. I think she made an extraordinarily difficult decision at Waco because she was just freshly on the job, and she had some really extraordinary circumstances to deal with. I certainly don't agree with everything that she did. And I think part of what you realize as you look at this is that FBI agents like taxi cab drivers and brain surgeons or anybody else in society have different political views. My political views may not jibe specifically with Janet Reno's, and I think I don't make any bones about the fact that I probably tended at the time to be a bit more conservative than Janet Reno in the Clinton administration. But I will say Janet Reno never shied from her responsibility, and she never shied from a decision, and I admire that greatly. I respect that a great deal. I felt during the Waco siege, ordeal, crisis, however you want to talk about it, that we spent too much time negotiating and working through that. I know that's a very controversial thing to say, but there was a very strong sentiment among people I worked with during the early days of Waco that had we been allowed by Washington to do what we were used to doing, we, the hostage rescue team, were used to doing, we felt that we could have saved more of the people inside, considerably more, and as tragically most of them perished in that fire. So it was enormously frustrating. There was certainly a period after Waco that became very, very difficult, and many things were blamed on Janet Reno. My feeling is that she was brave in making that decision, that at least in some ways it was the right decision, and that I admired most of what she did during her time in Washington. I got a couple seeds planted in the back of the room. I think my wife may ask a question, or one of my sons or something, if it gets really ugly down here. Yes, ma'am.
What sort of response should we expect after the first military action if we go after Afghanistan?
Well, I think it's really interesting now that we have a foregone conclusion that we're going to have a military action. And I saw that we are gearing up. What's that? If, right. Well, I think it's almost when now. But recently we've just seen today, as a matter of fact, that they're moving carrier groups and lots of resources over to the Middle East that weren't there specifically in those places before. The climate in America has changed, unlike anything I've seen in my lifetime, certainly during my career in law enforcement, to a point where America now has changed its sentiment. I went on a show, I'm trying to remember which one it was because there's been a couple lately, the Geraldo Rivera show. I finally got a couple of people to smile out here, a couple of chuckles, because that was supposed to be a joke earlier about the, never mind. But the Geraldo Rivera show with Alan Dershowitz, who espoused in public proactive assassination. Alan Dershowitz is probably the leading civil libertarian in the United States, a brilliant man, a constitutional scholar, and widely known liberal. Is that a safe word to say? I don't mean that with any pejorative. I think that's a term that he uses, actually. At any rate, it was very odd to hear him say two things. One, that he backed planned state assassinations, and two, that he would offer his defense services to the prosecution to try and preempt any defense strategy by anyone should these people be brought to justice, which I thought was fascinating. But I point to that only because it brings up how much the public sentiment has changed toward this whole situation, to a point where we are getting all of these other countries aligned behind a military response, a military strategy for bringing bin Laden to justice, for bringing some of his associates, and I think there may be some misunderstanding about how wide-ranging these associates can be, and to, I don't know if I'd use the word punishing, but certainly influencing the Taliban in further dealings with bin Laden. So we are certainly gearing up toward a military response, and I think that the response will be not a cruise missile strike like we saw with Bill Clinton, but it'll be something much more involved than that. And I think that it's important to point out that I believe it will dovetail closely with the criminal investigation being conducted right now, because we've gotten to a point now in backing down for a week or 10 days before this thing ends, or next phase starts, I think, where we're looking at some credible evidence that our prosecutors can use to justify some sort of punishment. I mean, this is not a knee-jerk reaction. It's not a knee-jerk response. This is something that's calculated, that's planned out, that's based on credible evidence, and that will have some appearance anyway of a justice.
What sort of reaction can we expect in Washington and New York and throughout the country? Are there terrorists that are hidden throughout the country that are going to bomb trains and metros?
Well, the question is, what kind of response can we anticipate? Are there people hiding out there among us who plan to react after that? And I think, you know, I don't want to dodge the question, but I think it's very tough to answer. I think it's very, very likely other people in the United States plan to cause problems. I don't think there's any doubt about that. Whether they'll do that, whether we respond or not, I think is a safe bet that they will. I mean, these people that bombed the World Trade Centers in the Pentagon and crashed that plane in Pennsylvania, they didn't have to wait for us to attack Afghanistan. They didn't have to wait for us to do anything else. This was a preemptive strike on their part. It was a direct provocation. It was a direct act of war in the minds of many, many people. And I think it's really difficult to extend the logic to say if we retaliate or if we respond, then they're going to get really angry. You know, it's like when you're a kid. Well, I don't know about you guys, but when I was a kid and I'd get in a fight, you know, and I'd be dancing around the schoolyard or something, and you'd be boxing a little bit, and he said, well, you know, if you hit me any harder, I'm going to get really mad. Well, if I hit him any harder, he was going to fall down and he wasn't going to get back up. So I think there's certainly that element that we look at it and say, if we are, in fact, declaring war on terrorism, we have to be prepared to carry that war to a point where they won't be able to respond. And that's not just an attack on Afghanistan. It's not just an attack on the Middle East. It's attacking figuratively and literally many, many different aspects of this. It's changing laws to change, alter, maybe expand intelligence community capabilities, and some of these things that fringe on doing away with some of our privacies and some of our personal liberties. Are we ready for that yet? I don't know, but I know that people are talking about that, and I know we're getting close. So I'm not worried about a response from a military attack. I'm worried about a response, period. And I think the military attack would be a step in the right direction, quite frankly. Yes, sir.
Well, our law enforcement agencies right now are somewhat fragmented. You have the Border Patrol, it's under one group. You have the ATF here. You have various other agencies. You have the FBI, with the CIA, totally different. And from what I've heard in some of the things in the news, some agencies had warnings of some of these people, but they didn't quite make it through the chain. Do you see more of an amalgamation of these agencies in the future, more of a combining?
The short answer is yes, but I don't give many short answers, so I'll explain that a little bit. I think we definitely need in this country a quote-unquote terrorism czar. We need someone to coordinate the efforts of all these different agencies. Most people don't realize there are 18,000 law enforcement agencies in the United States alone. 18,000 agencies in the United States, which is extraordinary. Yes?
I would have followed, I guess, because a lot of other countries have what is known as the Ministry of the Interior, which basically controls virtually all the police force.
Right. I don't know that. I don't know that I really back that idea, because I think, well, and I'll tell you why. Because in the United States we have local crime, we have state crime, and we have federal crime. That seems odd, but murder is a local crime. Murder is not a federal crime unless it occurs on a government reservation. So we have a sort of a tiered approach toward law enforcement. When I was an agent, and I should note now that I left the FBI on Friday, and I'll explain that a little bit later on. But yeah, there's something. But there's a tiered response because you have different violations, and federal violations and local and state violations always don't even go in the same place. So what we have when we deal with terrorism is, you know, a local infraction for somebody littering, but that litter they leave in the street could be a bag with a nuclear bomb in it, and then you get the federal agencies involved. So it makes it very, very difficult to align all of these different things. However, federal agencies working together to provide intelligence and to share intelligence and to share information about individuals need to work together in order to chase these people down. So I do back the idea of bringing all these groups together under the leadership of one coordinator, but I think it would be really tough to stretch that out across the United States and across the world to bring everybody together. So what I believe we're going to end up with is someone who coordinates the efforts of intelligence and law enforcement communities in counterterrorism operations, and it includes a much smaller number of agencies than everyone in the country. Yes?
To the extent you can tell us, what will be the role of the hostage rescue team in the current crisis?
Okay, the hostage rescue team, which I served on for 6 years and which I write about a lot in the book, is a misunderstood and little known organization, I think. The FBI in the early 1980s, actually the late 1970s, looked at the Munich Games, the Munich terrorist action the terrorist action at the Munich Games, and said, look, if something like this happens, how do we respond to it? And the first answer was, well, we go to the Army and we go to the Navy. We go to Delta or we go to SEAL Team 6, which made sense to some people. Well, the British SAS, the 22nd SAS, was called to respond to a place called Prince's Gate in 1980, where terrorists took over, I believe it was the Iranian embassy, and had to go in, use force to free the hostages, and in doing so, killed a number of the terrorists. Well, they're a military unit. What happened is that one of the terrorists was not killed. So they brought the terrorist out, and they suddenly said, well, what do we do with this fella? They didn't have any arrest authority. They didn't have no rules of evidentiary or rules of criminal procedure. They didn't know rules of evidence gathering. They didn't have any training in law enforcement elements. So they said, well, what do we do now? How do we prosecute? What evidence do we have? Where did we get the evidence? Things like that. So the United States government looked at that and said, well, if we do a terrorist incident and we don't kill all the terrorists, what do we do with them? And suddenly we realized that the posse comitatus prevented the use of military and civilian law enforcement operations. Everyone backed up a minute and said, who do we get to do this? And the answer was, we don't have anyone. So they put together this idea, this group called the Hostage Rescue Team, which started in 1983, January 3rd of 1983. They brought 50 FBI agents who'd already been trained in all of the things I just talked about back to Quantico, Virginia, and they gave them military training, SWAT training, and some specialized training that they were still developing at the time. They gave them the equipment and the resources and the time, quite frankly, to bring themselves up to speed to be the equivalent of these military units. So now you have people who train in the same tactics, have the same gear, and travel in the same circles, really, as these military units, but they are badge-carrying law enforcement officers in the United States. So that's the reasoning behind it. They put the team together, and they have evolved over the last, 18 years, I guess, to a point where they represent the primary counterterrorism response cell for the United States government. Now, certainly Delta and SEAL Team 6 are extraordinary groups, and I don't mean to belittle that at all. Extremely capable. They're warriors and the best in the world. But we don't always need warriors in a situation in the United States, and the hostage rescue team waits for something less than that. Does that address it?
Will the HRT be involved in the current crisis, or what kinds of things would they be doing?
Okay, yes, the FBI will be involved in the hostage rescue team is certainly involved in this crisis on a number of different areas. Lots of times they're held in reserve because, quite frankly, they're an insurance policy. These guys don't go out to do SWAT arrests. These guys are held in reserve should everything else fail. So you say, well, what would fail? We very easily could find 1 or 2 or 10 of these terrorists that people have alleged remain out there in America somewhere. We find them and have to arrest them. It's certainly not going to be an easy thing to do, so they could very easily be called in for arrest there. They may be called in to go to other countries and bring them back. Lots of people don't realize that the hostage rescue team and the FBI have traveled to many, many different countries around the world and brought back terrorists already. I don't know that many people talk about that much, but dating back to the 1980s, mid-1980s, we went after a fellow named Fawaz Yunus, who was a TWA hijacker, and brought him back to justice in the United States. We brought Mir Amal Khanzi, who everyone I think knows in the Washington, D.C. area. Fawaz Yunus, not Fawaz Yunus, who was Ramzi Youssef. Ramzi Youssef was one of the most recent. So HRT has gone around the world to bring these people back before, and they may be called to do it here as well. Now, HRT, I can't see a role for them in a military operation, but they will represent United States interests anytime we run up against something in the United States, in terms of arrests, in terms of responding to another terrorist crisis, something of that nature. So they have a strong role right now, and they're ready to go as we speak. Yes, ma'am.
I'm a lawyer and I work a lot with police officers, and like any other group, some are nice, some aren't, some are smart, some are not. But sometimes what happens is they want so much to defend their own, the less intelligent, want so much to defend whatever it is, because they put so much time and work and effort that their understanding of what's going on is skewed. Does that operate in these, and if so, it does operate in these large, what do you do about that, especially when the stakes are so high?
No, it's a great question, talking about the intelligence and what happens to you when you get into an organization, things like that. I think that's really what I try to talk about in this book. I talk about coming in with certain ideals and certain intelligence maybe, and becoming indoctrinated, the culture that sort of consumes you after a time, what that does to you and how it changes your perspective. My perspective is this. I admire law enforcement officers because I think they offer a great deal to society, altruistically, at least initially. But they're human beings, and things happen to human beings when they live in a really tough environment day after day after day. The men that I worked with on the hostage rescue team, and I say men because as of yet there haven't been any women. There may be someday, but there haven't been yet. But the men that I worked with on the hostage rescue team came into the FBI from reasonable degrees of accomplishment in previous careers. I mean, most of the people that come into the FBI have a law degree, have a CPA, have a master's degree, a language specialty or something, because it's quite difficult to get in. And they bring that intelligence to the hostage rescue team. The hostage rescue team looks to FBI agents who have 3 or more years of experience, and they try to find people who have some degree of athleticism and some shooting ability, but what they really bring back is a decision-making ability. Because, quite frankly, here's what HRT does. God forbid something happens in this room, we're held captive by, say, 3 or 4 people, terrorists, hostage takers, bank robbers that are looking for a place to hide out, whatever it may be, and they call them in. Ultimately, they're not called in here, the hostage rescue team isn't called in here to shoot, they're called in here to save us. That's the bottom line. In doing so, they may be called in to kill someone. I mean, that's also a bottom line. So they have to be decision makers that can run in among a crowd like this and see a weapon standing next to you, sir, and shoot the person with the weapon, even though you're the person that's running toward them, diving at them because you want to be saved. Or even though you're the person that in an act of bravery has reached out to this terrorist and grabbed a hold of him and tried to wrestle the gun away from him. They've got to decide whether you're the one with a gun or whether they're the one with a gun, which to shoot and which not to shoot. That, with explosives going off and the doors caving in and flashbang grenades going off all around and smoke and screaming, all of that becomes a very, very tough situation to deal with. And I think that most of the guys on HRT take greatest pride in being able to differentiate between those things, concentrate on the job and doing that. Now, if you can call that intelligence, I don't know. I'll say this. 2 of the guys I worked with on HRT had PhDs. A large number of them were attorneys like yourself. A large number of them, including my last sniper partner, had a CPA. In fact, when he introduced himself to me, he was wearing an 18-karat gold Rolex President, which I was completely blown away because I can't afford an 18-karat gold President. And this guy's coming on to HRT as a sniper. He'd come as a controller for a fairly large corporation and had an extraordinary pedigree as an accountant or as a financial manager. And I thought, well, how did he end up here? I thought, this is quite odd. But when you look around, though people don't really want to believe this, when you look around, you say that over and over again. Where did this person come from? Where did that person come from? And the bottom line is that they start with a reasonably good pool, and I'm the mud among them. I should say that right off the bat. I didn't have any of those things. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not a CPA. I didn't have a master's degree until after I went in the FBI. I didn't have any of those things. So they have, a certain number of people who sort of fall through the cracks like myself. But you also have some extraordinary people that do some extraordinary things. So, in terms of what happens over time, yes. to answer your question, certainly they buy into the culture. Law enforcement does certain things to your perceptions, but I think they start with a sound mind, and I think they cultivate that through education while you're in, and I think they encourage good decision making, and that's what I think separates this group most specifically from any other that I've worked with. Too long an answer? Okay. Yes, sir.
Is there a difference in the manner in which the FBI treats domestic issues like Ruby Ridge or Waco versus what would be considered international terrorism?
Is there a difference between the way the FBI and HRT treat domestic and international terrorism? And the answer is yes. I think no one would really argue that Waco or Ruby Ridge were terrorist acts, but they were perceived as huge events. And I think HRT is reserved for that tier of criminal enterprise that extends beyond what local or state law enforcement can respond to. And here's the short take on this, if I'm capable of such a thing. That if an event happens in a community, it's going to be resolved by the local police department if it can be. So let's say you start with a bank robbery, okay? It's going to be resolved by the local police department. Well, I won't use bank robbery because that's ultimately a federal offense. Let's say someone finds a bag on the corner out here, and under these times of heightened security, they call the local police department. The PD shows up, an officer on the street examines it, decides to call the bomb squad because he or she doesn't have the expertise to deal with it. The bomb squad comes, the technicians look at the package, say it may be a bomb, they back off. It exceeds their capability because they saw some things that suggest a nuclear or a chemical capability or something like that, and they call in the state. Canton, D.C., let me back up again. Let's say it's in Virginia. They call in the state authorities. They look at it. It exceeds their abilities. They call the FBI. Now we're looking at a possible terrorist attack. We're looking at something much that has gone up in complexity and danger level to a higher tier. They call the FBI, and the FBI is going to respond with its resources. If that response includes a threat of violence, they're going to call in the hostage rescue team, and they're going to wait for something to happen. Within the United States, you have all the constraints, all the freedoms guaranteed under the Constitution. You have all of the rules of evidence gathering, of criminal procedure, which you have to abide by in order to bring a successful prosecution. But now, if we move overseas, we can look at a very different set of circumstances. And I think actually maybe most of you don't know that in the United States, and I'm not an expert on this, but I know a man who is. I don't know if he's going to help me out with this or not. But in the United States, if you want to go and search something, if you want phone records, if you want information, there are provisions. You have to get a court order, you have to get a search warrant in order to get that information. When you're dealing with a national security issue, the standard is a bit different because the stakes are different. Is that a fair representation? So when you deal with things overseas, especially with intelligence gathering organizations, they may have a different standard of, I don't know if I want to say accountability, maybe a burden of proof. Would that be a fair representation? That they have a different burden of proof and that they have an enormous consequence. So I might be able to get a wiretap in a national security investigation for a communication that it would take me that it would be more difficult to get in a civilian, in a domestic, thank you, a domestic investigation. Okay, those basic differences amount to part of the overall consideration. Another part is that when we go overseas, we're probably doing something very different. Now, I went to Kosovo a couple of years ago, and excuse me that I think it was a year ago this last summer. It was a year ago this last summer. Went to Kosovo at the request of the International Criminal Tribunal for the former Yugoslavia, who was trying to bring to justice and prosecute Slobodan Milosevic, who now is going through just that. We went there, the FBI went there with a team, gathered evidence in a foreign country, carried weapons in a foreign country, brought that evidence back to the United States, gave it to The Hague, and offered it as evidence to be used in an international tribunal, which it's fairly unusual to do that. I mean, I think most of you would agree. When we went through the East Africa bombings in Tanzania and Kenya, Dar es Salaam and Nairobi, they had a very unusual situation there as well, because we had a terrorist attack on United States citizens in a foreign country. We went into that country, conducted an investigation, and are bringing the people responsible for that crime to justice in the United States. Yemen. I got back about a year ago from Aden, Yemen, where we spent 5 weeks investigating the coal bombing. We went over there, went into a sovereign country with weapons, conducted an investigation, and are now trying to bring the people responsible for that crime to justice in the United States, not The Hague. So the FBI, in the last probably 5 years, has expanded beyond what it's done in all of its history to reach out all around the world, either through these renditions that I talked about and getting Kanzi and Youssef and all of these people back to the United States, or prosecuting people and then bringing them back. We're reaching out now, we're worldwide, and they are very different in that regard. Yes, sir.
Since you talk about going to these foreign countries, particularly in Yemen, you must depend on obviously some other outside sources for a lot of language and translating, because I'm sure you're not all fluent in hundreds of languages, but...
No, you know, that's a very good point. That when, yes.
You get there in 5 weeks and got the evidence. Either there was a lot of evidence there, or there people were very cooperative. What I'm interested in that.
Two good questions. First, you may have to remind me of the second one in a second, but the first is that we have some language capability. We don't have enough. Obviously, when we went to Yemen, we went with language speakers, native language speakers who did the translating. They were FBI agents, and they were FBI support personnel, linguists, who could speak Arabic and the various dialects that we ran into, you know, throughout the Middle East. And they conducted most of the conversations with people who did not speak English, and many of them did speak English. The FBI certainly has language resources, obviously does not have enough language resources, and sometimes we have to rely on other intelligence agencies for that. So the short answer is, when we went to Yemen, we had enough people that spoke the language, and that made it a little bit easier. In terms of gathering evidence, I went for 5 weeks. Others stayed there much longer than that. And were they cooperative? This is tough now because I don't want to tread politically on ground I shouldn't probably. But I think it's important to note that lots of times the United States and countries consider cooperation along different lines. My personal interpretation is that we went into the country of Yemen in military aircraft carrying M16s, carrying handguns, and carrying enough ammunition to do, you know, to protect ourselves. I can't imagine another law enforcement agency calling up the President of the United States and saying, Mr. Bush, we want to bring our investigators over to the United States, about 65 or 70 of them, and we're going to bring our own machine guns. I can't imagine that happening. So when we go in there, the fact that they allowed us in to begin with was an extraordinary step of a gesture of goodwill, I think. What we found when we got in there was that gesture of goodwill led to a great deal of skepticism and of probably a fear, maybe rightfully so. So they kept an eye on us so closely that we couldn't do anything. I mean, I think we spent the first 10 days in the hotel and couldn't leave at all. I mean, couldn't go outside the hotel. The first 10 days I was there, I sat in this hotel while we were surrounded by the Yemeni military and couldn't leave. That was very unusual, and that was hard to get used to. When we landed our plane coming into the Aden, the Aden airport, which is one of, I believe, only 2 international airports in the country, they locked on our plane with surface-to-air missile radar and prompted the pilots to use electronic and physical countermeasures, which became a problem later on. So you have degrees of cooperation. They felt they were cooperating with the United States government, and there's no doubt in my mind that they believe that they were cooperating. But when you get in, the United States government has a tendency to go into situations like this and say, hey, we'll take over from here. Don't worry about it. And you can't do that in a foreign country. So what becomes a real interesting play that I've not heard much discussion of is the role or the difference between the FBI reaching out in a law enforcement capacity around the world and the State Department, which already exists in a diplomatic and facilitative capacity around the world, and bringing the two of them together. So it's not always just an issue of whether we get along with the government. It's oftentimes an issue of whether we get along with our own agencies. because we went in there to solve a crime, to bring these people to justice, and the State Department existed there to try and foster goodwill and diplomatic relations with that country. So it becomes very complex, and once again, I've rambled probably a little bit more than I should, but I think ultimately it comes down to the fact that many countries try very hard to cooperate with the United States, but sometimes it's tenuous.
One more little follow-up.
Okay.
You said you went. This was a essentially an attack on a United States ship,
Right.
and you say you went in there to solve a crime. Do you see that this metamorphosizing from being simple criminal acts to something greater than that?
Yes, I do. Do I see this changing from a criminal act to something more than that? You know, when you come from my background, 15 years in law enforcement, something like that has to be characterized as a criminal act. I mean, I'm used to finding something happening, trying to investigate it, and trying to help prosecutors put these people in jail. That's the bottom line. Do I see it as a crime? Yes. When we talk terrorism, we're taking it up a step a bit to what we witnessed last week, where you have what's pretty tough to argue is not a direct attack on the United States. I mean, we didn't call Pearl Harbor a terrorist attack. It was a declaration of war under different circumstances because the world was at war to a certain extent. But now we have a situation where we say, when does it go from crime to military action? And I think we haven't discussed that much in this country to this point. So it's a fascinating distinction that I think you bring there, and I really don't have an answer for that. Yes, sir.
Going back to Yemen, the U.S. ambassador, the lady, and you all had a pretty horrible argument. Who won that?
The question was, we, the FBI, and the ambassador, Mrs. Bodine, had a terrible argument going on. Who won that argument? And I'll say two things, should she ever listen. I think very highly of her. She's a brilliant woman, and I don't say that for political reasons because I'm out of the FBI now, and I don't give a doggone one way or another. But I did find her enormously engaging. She's very, very bright, and she's very, very dedicated, and she's a patriot. The problem is the United States government brought another wing into Yemen with all these weapons and with all these expectations and demands, and that made it very, very difficult for her to do her job. So now you have the ambassador, who really is the United States' highest interest in that country, without question, and you have a law enforcement agency saying, look, we need to bring these people to justice. We need to take these people back to the United States with evidence we can use in a way that makes sense to a federal court in the United States. Other countries, and I'm not going to comment specifically on Yemen, but other countries allow interview techniques that we don't use in this country. We seldom use cattle prods, and very seldom use water torture and various other things that are accepted. I mean, I don't think it's a secret. I think it's widely written that in Israel, it's perfectly acceptable to shake interview subjects. Now, I'm not talking about beating them to death, but that's an acceptable interview interrogation technique. We can't do that in the United States. So if we go into another country, we may not be able to do the same things they can. So if we want to go out and do an interview in Aden, for example, and talk to these people, we can't necessarily do it the way the Yemenis would do it because we may not be able to use the information gathered during that interview in a federal court in the United States. So what happened, to answer your question, is that Mrs. Bodine had certain expectations as a United States diplomat, and the FBI had certain expectations as a law enforcement agency, and it just took a time to bring those expectations in line. And I'm not sure that they ever came perfectly into line. So who won? I think Mrs. Bodine is still there on the job and doing quite wonderfully at it. And the FBI has pulled out and worked this thing from a different angle. So look, we're all in this game together, and I'm sure neither of these two interests think that they won and lost, that we're all doing the same thing together. But quite frankly, it doesn't always work out just perfectly, and that's what we're working toward in the future. Is that a fair question without being too diplomatic? Thank you. Yes, ma'am.
Are all ethnic groups, I mean, Arabs, Muslims, Chinese, are they all represented in the FBI, or is the FBI still, I gather there aren't very many women, so
well, that's interesting because, we're still dealing, quite frankly, and reeling from J. Edgar Hoover's legacy. And it's widely known he didn't hire female FBI agents until, what, 72 or 73 or something like that. It was the early 1970s, which boggles the mind. Look, the FBI investigates crimes in the United States. How do you investigate crimes in the United States with people who don't match the population? That baffles me. I don't understand that. Now we're saying we're investigating crimes around the world. We have to have people who match the population. We're all Americans. It doesn't matter what we look like. You know, we're all doing the same job. And I've heard this question over and over again. What do we do about racial profiling, and what do we do about people who look of Arab extract in the United States? You know, there's well-publicized crimes of violence against people that have a certain appearance. Excuse me. And I'll just say this. In Aden, Yemen, I worked with 2 FBI agents who struck me as 2 of the most heroic agents I've worked with in all my years. And I'm taking into consideration hostage rescue team operators and everybody else. These 2 people were of Arab extract. Is that fair? They were Arab Americans. They both spoke with strong Arabic accents, and I'm not sure that English was their first language, quite frankly. They both looked quite obviously Arab, and they could be mistaken for for any of the people that brought down these planes. These 2 agents risked their lives over there going against these terrorist groups, bin Laden and Islamic Jihad and Hamas and all these other groups, trying to bring these people to justice. These 2 men, or this man and this woman, one of each as a matter of fact, could be walking down the streets of New York or the streets of Washington, D.C., and have somebody throw a rock at them and call them a name and some racial slur at them, when they're the very people who are trying to keep us from getting killed to begin with. So when I hear stuff like that, it makes me angry. I mean, it makes me very, very angry, because you don't know, just because of the way someone looks, whether they're out there working on the front lines trying to protect us, or whether you have some mistaken representation that they're going to, mistaken idea that they're going to cause a crime. So I get very upset about that. I really do. But to answer your question, the FBI now has representatives from virtually every group you could imagine, not specifically because they're shopping for that, but because, quite frankly, Americans apply to the FBI, and you're an American, you're a female. Sir, you're an American, you're an African American, and we have, in this room alone, we have many different ethnic backgrounds represented. Those people are us. We're it. Just because you're male or female or one color doesn't mean anything. And the FBI has gone to extraordinary lengths, I think, in trying to attract these people into the FBI. It's taken time, and we're a long ways away from that. But that's certainly the idea. And I hope people remember that when they see somebody on the street and they may represent their interests just because of the way they look. Yes, sir.
Briefly, that if these people are getting onto an airplane, until they properly identify themselves, would it not be proper to give them a second look?
I read a story in in the New York Times on the train today, coming back down, about a flight attendant on one of the first flights out of a domestic airport after the ban was lifted just a couple days ago actually. And this flight attendant said, look, I feel badly saying this, Emery. I feel badly saying this, but they walked up to the lavatory near the cockpit, tried the door, it was locked. They stood outside the cockpit, and this flight attendant just yelled at them, started yelling at them. Excuse me, let me back up a second. They were Sikh and they had a turban. They yelled at them to sit back down in their seat, and felt very badly afterward that they'd made that representation right off the bat. We're human beings. Everyone has some bias and disposition, not necessarily in a prejudicial sense, but you may feel certain things. They felt threatened in that situation, and it's very tough to tell someone that their gut instincts are wrong. But the bottom line was that they recognized that very quickly, and they understood that that was an unfair representation, and that wasn't the case. So my answer to your question directly is that we talk about profiling. We talk about criminal profiling, racial profiling, all these different things. There is a big difference between profiling someone that is driving down the highway that may have drugs in their car, that lots of local law enforcement agencies use, and the type of profiling the guys I worked with down in Quantico used to identify criminals. And they're not the same thing. Profiling in the first instance talks about people that you can say, well, based on certain crimes, we think that statistically this person looks like a certain whatever. It's terribly flawed, oftentimes not statistically realistic in any way, and it's oftentimes proven to be complete bunk, and it's been, drummed out of virtually every law enforcement agency that I know of, or it's certainly in the process of that. On the other hand, you have a certain group of people, better known as behavioral analysts, who look at behaviors, not at color, not at ethnicity, not at religious background, none of those things. They look at behaviors and demonstrations of those behaviors, and they use those to project things about future behaviors. So you'll take a crime scene, for example, and you'll say, we have a crime scene that has certain blood spatter patterns where they've done certain things to the victim, they've left things, they've brought weapons in, they found weapons on the scene, they left a certain way, they broke in, they didn't break in, they tied up the person with a phone cord. All of these things, they look at vast amounts of data compiled in other crimes, and they look at various things they've learned through psychological examination of personalities, and they say, based on these behaviors, or these demonstrations of behaviors, we can project that the suspect will be X, Y, and Z. And they've had extraordinary success in doing that. Extraordinary success. And I could use examples if you want to go into those. But they're very, very different. So how does that deal with your question? When you go into an airport and you have to make a determination if someone's going to go on a plane and commit a terrorist act, I don't know that's possible, because you're dealing with huge numbers of people. I talked to a gent the other day that said we had 40,000 flights a day in the United States, 20,000 takeoffs and 20,000, or no, I don't know, at any rate, he said 40,000 flights during a 24-hour time over the United States, which seems remarkable to me, but that's what he said. How are you going to screen 40,000 flights with an average of 200 people on each flight using any sort of profile whatsoever? You're not. So you have to control what goes on the plane in terms of weaponry, because if I go on a plane and just stand up and say I'm hijacking the plane, people will subdue me, probably beat me into submission and stuff me under a seat until we get back down to I can be arrested. But if you go onto a plane with a knife, you have grand tragedy in the making. And I'll say this, I flew back Monday night before last Tuesday, Monday night before the bombings. I flew back from London on a 747, and I was sitting 3 rows behind the cockpit. And I spent a lot of time on planes, both flying and when I was on the hostage rescue team practicing with taking hijackings, because that's one thing they do, is to work hijackings. So I'm sitting in the seat, and they brought my dinner, which was quite nice, and they gave me my silver, which included a steak knife. And I picked up this knife, and I looked at it in my hand, and I looked around, and I saw everybody else had one that had the same meal. And it was a steak knife. It had an extremely sharp edge. It had an extremely sharp point, and it was long enough that I could have done terrible things with that knife, which I thought, in my mind, long before this, or 12, 18 hours before this happened, I thought, how could they hand these things out on planes? Because I'd only seen the soft butter knives, which wouldn't threaten much of anyone. So I thought, well, this is really odd. So I'm sitting in my seat eating my dinner, and all of a sudden the door to the cockpit opened up, and just stayed opened up. And I could look right into the cockpit, and I saw the gents flying the plane. It happened to be 2 male pilots, and the engineer. And so I thought, well, this is really odd too. And then I saw the flight attendants bringing people from the plane up to go into the cockpit. They'd walk around in the cockpit at 35, 40,000 feet, however high we were. They'd walk around and then they'd go back. They came, they collected the silver. I gave up my steak knife. I hope everybody else did too. I think they did. And I was waiting. We start the descent. They bring somebody else in. They sit him in the cockpit, and they put him right behind the pilot in a chair, right behind the pilot in a 747, and left the door wide open. Now, not only could somebody walk into the cockpit, they're sitting in the cockpit. And there seemed to be a bit of a kindly lady. She didn't look like a terrible threat to me, so I didn't get too wound up about it. But I thought on the way down, how hard would it be to stand up, dive over the pilot, hit the yoke, and splash 350 people into Dulles Airport? That kind of thing is overboard in the wrong direction. We can't screen everybody going on a flight. We cannot possibly control every aspect on a plane, but we can do things like lock the door. We can stop giving people steak knives, and we can do things like that. Yes?
I fly quite a bit too, and that was the one thing that came to my mind was since you said you had a lot of training on planes, could you see any way those doors could be made more secure that they couldn't be kicked in
Absolutely, absolutely.
easily? I mean,
LL.
without massive...
No, LL has excellent security to the cockpit. That's not a big deal. I mean, the pilots can get out of there if they need to and use the lavatories or get a cup of coffee or whatever they need to do. Domestic flights in the United States aren't longer than 5 hours anyway. I mean, it's, you know, maybe a little longer than that going coast to coast sometimes, but not much longer than that. And then that's not a problem. I can't imagine anyone would argue that's a problem. And you can make a plane any way you want. You could put a steel vault in the middle of a plane if you want to. So you could easily harden the bulkhead to the cockpit, and you could make that a simple solution.
If those doors had been secured, then this wouldn't have happened.
Well, I think that's a pretty reasonable argument, sure. I think that's a really reasonable argument. You know, planes are tough. There's no doubt about it. Everyone talks about the Marshals program, the Sky Marshals program, which was done away with quite some time ago. What you may not know is that every domestic flight in the United States is extremely likely to have an armed person on board anyway, because anytime an FBI agent, an ATF agent, a DEA agent, any federal law enforcement agent, and there are many, many that you probably haven't even heard of, anytime they get on a domestic United States or a domestic U.S. flight, they are carrying a weapon. So they're not Sky Marshals, but if somebody pulls out a knife and threatens to commit an act of terror, they certainly have the ability to respond. I found it extraordinary, absolutely extraordinary, that those 4 flights left from the East Coast bound for the West Coast and didn't have a single law enforcement officer on any of them. It was a freak thing, I think. In my 15 years, I think I've flown on very few flights where there wasn't another officer on board with a weapon, because they tell you, you know who each other are. You know, I mean, I know if there's somebody else on the plane. So that really surprised me. Trying to put Sky Marshals on 40,000 flights a day, working 3 shifts and time off for holidays and vacation and stuff like that, you're talking about the largest police force in the history of the world, number one, and you're talking about a distinct problem in the sense that if you shoot a handgun in a pressurized cabin, you've got problems that make the terrorists go away in a hurry. I mean, they make ammunition that could do less damage, but still, you've got a major problem doing that anyway. So my short answer is that is a solution that makes sense on paper. It sounds good when you hear it on the ABC News or something like that. But when it comes right down to it, it's not as simple as that. It's going to take more than just putting Sky Marshals or a plane just to put Sky Marshals on planes. That alone won't do it. Yes, sir.
It's come to light as a result of the World Trade Center bombings. One of the massive failures that led to this occurrence was the lack of intelligence gathering capability, especially in the Central Intelligence Agency. But as the week has progressed, clues have been emanated through the news broadcast saying that the FBI has been warned through several countries that there could have been something like this. Obviously, your comment about a terrorist czar could probably identify some pattern that might have generated some action in a preventive manner. But where does excluding the human intelligence element, was there any other failures that occurred in possibly coordination between the CIA and FBI, especially as we look at clues that are arising from within the boundaries of the United States?
The question was about clues, about breakdowns between intelligence gatherers, the FBI, where the information goes. Yes, clearly there were breakdowns. There's no doubt about that. When you look at the breakdowns, it makes a little bit better sense. The United States has 13 primary intelligence gathering agencies, which include the FBI, many of which most people don't talk about commonly. I mean, everybody knows about the CIA. Maybe many of you probably work for the CIA or the FBI or some of these agencies. I don't know. But in dealing with the information they gather, you present a staggering problem in assimilating all that data. I could know absolutely everything going on in the city of Washington, D.C. right now, the intimate details of each of your lives, and everything about traffic patterns to book sales in the store. But if something came up and I had to reach into that giant grab bag of information to find the few bits and pieces that might actually prevent a crime, there's no way I could do that. It would take too long to do that with the existing ability to mine that data. So we may monitor 1 million phone calls an hour worldwide, but you have to find out which of those million conversations is going to mean something to the President of the United States 5 seconds from now. And that is what's hard. So getting from the CIA to the NSA to the FBI to some other group takes some time, and it's very, very difficult to do that. even when you have that information, I saw a story today that the jet, or that the military jets scrambled and were 8 minutes away from intercepting the planes that hit the World Trade Centers. Well, you have a simple logistical problem of getting these assets and bringing them to bear, even with the best of intelligence. You have reports that the FBI had 2 of the names on the list of people aboard these planes who were believed to be terrorists, and you may say, well, how's that happen? And I'd point out that there's a list of 10 FBI fugitives who we want more than people can believe, the top 10 fugitives, and there are thousands more like them. In the United States, in a free society, you can't find everyone immediately. And if there were 2 people on that board that the FBI, or plane that the FBI was looking for, as tragic as it sounds, you can't always find everyone just in the time, specifically when you need them. So clearly, we had problems with intelligence and breakdowns, but ultimately you have to look at the staggering responsibility of these organizations and say, how do we bring those resources together? How do we develop new technologies that allow us to mine data from them very quickly for the really important stuff to rise to the top, and so that everybody can get this information? And we're definitely working in that way, but clearly not there yet. I'm told, I get this note here, because I talked too long, but I only have time for one more question, a quick one. Yes, sir.
Why has it been so difficult to freeze bin Laden's assets?
Short answer is I don't know. I really don't know the answer to that question. I know in dealing with international money enterprise, it's much easier now than, well, I don't know, maybe it always has been, but I know it's very, very difficult to track things because different countries have different reporting and accounting rules, and it's widely known that many corporations do business in Switzerland or in offshore banking because they have different privacy requirements and regulations, and it makes it more difficult to get in and find out detailed information about a person's finances. So it's easy for us to say now, hey, we should have known about his money, but quite frankly, if it's my money and I've already paid my taxes, I want it to stay my money, and I don't mind having some protections. So once again, we get into that civil liberties question, saying at what point do we draw the line? And right now we're sort of trying to define that line. Well, thank you very much. I really appreciate the questions. I'll only say this because I didn't talk so much about specifically about Cold Zero, but I deal with the vast majority of the things that we talked about tonight in the book and in some detail. And specifically the last chapter, which projects a crisis very much like what happened in New York, and talks about the specific response, and it talks in great detail about how that happens and when that happens. So I thank you very, very much for coming out tonight. It's very kind of you. Representation. And those boiled down into 2 major events, which were Ruby Ridge and Waco, which are 2 of the most controversial and hotly contested events in law enforcement history, and probably fairly significant events in American history. No one from the FBI had talked much about those events because the FBI, seemed loath to bring up these sorts of subjects and to deal with them. The line at the FBI when all the years that I worked there was, don't worry about what the media write. The American people know what happened, and everything will be okay. Well, look, if the American people know what happened based on what they read and what they see on television, what they hear on the radio and things like that, how can you expect them to know anything else, or how can you expect them to feel anything else? So years went by, things that had been written became fact, and representations made became reality, and I got to a point in writing this book where I thought, I hope I get a chance to change some of those things. So if you bring any presuppositions here tonight, maybe we could discuss them, and maybe I could talk you into at least considering some other alternatives, some other possibilities anyway. So I sat down and said, well, how do I turn that into the title of a book? And what I came up with was a sniper's term. And a sniper's term for hitting your mark came from 2 words: the cold bore shot, which is pulling a rifle up out of its case and lying down behind it and taking a shot, but then a couple of years later it worked out. So I went back, I got the contract, I went back and I wrote down recollections I had from the times in the FBI that I worked through some of these significant events, and they rolled into a manuscript. The manuscript went up to my editor called back and he said, look, we have to address a couple issues here. One is that this story doesn't make any sense. You have a bunch of recollections, but there's no story here. So that was my big thing, was to go back and turn what had been some very personal experiences for me into a story that might make sense to you. And that took I don't know, that took a couple months later. And then finally had to come up with some kind of a title. And I was thinking about different titles for this book, and really had found myself at a loss. You know, titling a book, especially now, is very difficult because so many titles have been used. You know, I won't even go into some that I considered, but Truman Capote's gotten a lot of them, and Hemingway got a lot of them, and you know, they'd pretty much milked the Bible for all the great lines in there, and there are a considerable number, but they seem to have been taken. So I sat down and I looked at what the book represented to me, what I really wanted to try and do in the book, and what I really wanted this book to be, though some will argue, and I embrace argument and discussion, but what I really wanted to do with the book was try and portray things that I had seen and that I had participated in a way I hadn't seen done before, which was the way what I considered a truth.
And we're really, really very pleased to have Christopher Whitcomb here tonight with us. As you all probably know, he's a veteran with the FBI, spent 15 years on the force, and has written his book, Cold Zero, which, as we were discussing, is more than about bombs or terrorists or hostages. It's basically one man's journey and his coming to terms and living in these situations and how these situations affect him as well as the rest of our country. So I'm very pleased to bring him here, and I'm very pleased to introduce him. And would you all please welcome Mr. Christopher Whitcomb.
Well, thank you, Timmy. I appreciate that introduction. It's very kind of you. And thank you all for coming out tonight. I appreciate that very much, too. I know it's been pretty tough recently getting anyone out in the streets at all. I just came back from New York this afternoon, and it's very different there than here even, and I know it's very different here than elsewhere in America because these two cities have suffered so much. So thank you very much for coming out tonight. I should warn you that I do terribly with podiums and lecterns. I'm allergic to them. So if I try to come around this thing and talk, you'll have to send me back. Oh, can you? Well, actually, I like going around the other side. But
all right, you can come. Hey, whatever you want to do.
I think they need the microphone, don't they?
Why don't you try it, see if they can hear you without.
I'm getting a wand trouble making sense of it all. For any of you that are aspiring writers, for those of you that have already published, that are way ahead of me, maybe some of you, you might have looked at the process and wondered how you get a book started, how you get a book out, how a book gets onto the bookshelves. And when I look back on the process, I really can't figure out what that process was. My wife's in the back of the room, and she could attest to this story. In originally trying to find an agent for my first novel, I went to everyone I could imagine, and they all gave me the same thing. You know, it was a form letter that said, "Thank you very much for calling us, but you know, we have other people to look at." So I eventually hooked up with an agent in Toronto, Canada, which when you're trying to publish a book in the United States is probably not the best idea. But that's all I had to go to. So I called her up. She read the book. She called me back, which was good because I usually ask for a self-addressed stamped envelope. So she actually called me on the phone, which I thought, hey, I'm making progress now. They're calling me on the phone. And she said, Mr. Whitcomb, she's very formal, Mr. Whitcomb, I really appreciate you calling and sending this book, but I think you should know that I have a Freudian problem with chicken farms, therefore I could not complete your book. So I thought about it and I said, a Freudian problem with chicken farms, which perhaps some psychologists among you could help me out with that a little bit. But I did mention a chicken farm at one point in the book, and apparently that was her way of getting out of considering the thing any further. So that didn't go very well, and that sort of soured me on the whole process. From the back that they need the microphone. So I'll start here and try this. What I'd like to do tonight, really, is talk about what you want to talk about, because I think this book sort of blends with many of the terrible things that have happened in the last week, and sort of talk about what's happening in the world, what's happening with the FBI, if I can shed some light on that. Talk about some of the things I wrote about in the book and give you maybe a little bit of a background, a little bit of an idea what the FBI does, what the United States government does in times of crisis like this, and sort of steer this the way that interests you. So would it be all right if I just started out with a little bit about the book, why I wrote it, something like that, and then just go where you want to go? Well, Cold Zero really started as an accident. This book came about during a conversation I had with a couple guys in New York about 2 years ago. I had 3 chapters of recollections stuck in a drawer someplace in my house. I had written a novel in 1992 that I never did anything with, and had thought about writing another novel, but had just put some of these recollections down and really forgotten about them. But I was talking to these other gents about another project entirely. It was a movie script, ironically, that had nothing to do with these. And that conversation turned to these chapters turned to an agent, and the agent turned to this event, which is the first book signing I've gone to, and which is an extraordinary event for me because this is something I've looked forward to all my life. So I look back on the process and really have